Hi, I'm Gracie Mercedes, and welcome back to Not Blank Enough, a podcast about everyday insecurities and triumphs. In this episode, I'm talking with Matt Law, an actor, writer, filmmaker, and activist who shares what it's like to grow up biracial. We also spoke about the Black Lives Matter movement and what you can do to stay involved. I hope you enjoy our conversation that we titled Not Black Enough. Hello, Matthew.
Hello, Gracie.
Welcome to Not Blank Enough. I want to let the audience in on something. I had recorded 5 interviews to launch the podcast, and I always thought I wanted you to be a guest. But in light of recent events, I wanted to talk to you even sooner because you have been out there, man. And I definitely want to talk about that. But before we even get there, I want to know more about Matthew and his upbringing. And when did you start to feel any sort of like not enoughness?
Dang, if anybody knows me, they know I'm from Seattle because I talk about it all the time. I'm very proud of the city that I'm from. I was raised in Seattle, but in truth, I was born in Yakima, Washington. Yakima is the main exporter of apples. So if you've had treetop, it's also the main exporter of meth in the state of Washington. But it took me a long time, to even say like, oh, I'm from Yakima. Because I think I had that sense of not enoughness. I've always really envied people who can automatically have worth by claiming where they're from, right?
Yeah, I'm from New York.
Yeah. Born and raised.
Born and raised right here.
Yeah, born and raised, right? So to come from a place that is so, at least from the surface, lacking. Because if you say Yakima in Washington, people are like, ooh.
So yeah, tell me a little bit more about Yakima, because I'm assuming most people don't know anything about it. Like when you were in school, what kind of kids were you in school with?
A large Latino population. My best friend was the only other like black kid. Shout out Edwin. That he saved me from getting my ass beat quite a few times.
By who?
At that time, it was the kids trying to take my marbles. That's how poor Yakima is. We played marbles like in the dirt.
Wait, what year was this that you were playing marbles?
1892. It was 98. 97. The complexion was very much many poor whites, a high Latino population, and the Yakima Reservation is actually, I think, the only place in the United States where the Latino population is higher than Native American. So those kids, I didn't really have, the only friend I had was Edwin. Everybody else just beat me up. The kids who I thought were my friends beat me up.
Why were they beating you up? Tell me about young Matthew, that he was getting beat up all the time.
I was babysat by my buddy who I thought was my friend, and right, he's half Mexican, half white. And then some other boys who would get babysat by the mom. And I remember seeing his dad just beat the living, can I swear on here?
Yeah.
Yeah, just the living shit out of him, Yeah. And it's so normalized. And so the games that these kids would play, who I thought were my friends, were, and this is what I'm talking about the ignorance that comes from and this hatred. They call it spear the queer. And whoever had the ball was the queer. And you spear them by hitting them as hard as possible. Like, that's taught hatred, right? So they'd throw me the ball and I get hit.
Oh my God.
In Yakima is where I, retreated into my imagination. And I'm an only child, so my mom working all day. And I'm actually very grateful, I realized, to come from a rural place, because all you had a lot of times was the stars, right? Like, I had such a relationship with nature from so early, and your imagination.
Well, now, present day, I should mention that you're an actor, you're a filmmaker, you're an amazing editor, you're an amazing cinematographer, you're an activist. You have all these creative endeavors. So do you feel like, that came from using your imagination as such a young kid?
Yes, I think. Because I grew up on that diet, my mom is working her ass off. And so, I had to just kind of play, in the sense that there is nothing responding to you other than your own imagination, that you're bouncing that ball up. That's the wall that you're bouncing it off of. And also the fiction that I picked up, right? So I'm huge into video games. Like, you would get lost in the worlds. I'm huge into comic books, and I would read voraciously. I was obsessed with stories of moral heroes, right? And so that's maybe how I started to shape my narrative of what it meant to be a man, because I didn't have my dad growing up. He left when I was like 1. So, those lessons came from being alone and having fiction that filled a gap of leadership.
What I did growing up in Brooklyn, New York, where there is no nature and your options are sitting on the stoop, maybe riding your bike like right in front of your house because you can't really go very far, was TV. So I was just obsessed with television. Watched probably way too much of it as a kid. And I think that's definitely why I ended up wanting to be an actor and now a writer and director, because I was so immersed in those worlds and loved those worlds, and that's where I could like escape my little Brooklyn apartment. Okay, so that's your youth. And then at what point do you go to Seattle?
I went to Seattle when I was 8.
Oh, so you're pretty young still. Yeah.
Yeah, or 9. I mean, it was very formative. You know, it's crazy. Like my formative memories all take place in Seattle. But I think that that's also like we're talking about the not enoughness. I almost tried to like push that many years out of my life just because it was so it lacked substance in my mind. But in reality, once again, you know, when you start mining through the worth of your life and that self-examination, it's like, oh, there is so much of who I am is rooted in, right, appreciation of nature and those things. And the other half of that is city. I need the city in my life, you know, and that comes from Seattle. So when I moved to Seattle, the first thing that happened basically was my dad dying, right? So I didn't know my dad very well. And he ended up dying because we went rafting for his Father's Day thing. And you know, he rarely came back, but he wanted to do something fun. And so he ended up drowning on that trip, you know, and I was there in the raft and had my near-death experience. And the death of my father, as I moved to a city, and you're constantly comparing who you are to the people around you. But when you get familiar with death at a young age, it's a ostracizing event, you know what I mean? Because now all of a sudden, there is something that has shocked me outside of the reality that all these other kids live with. And there are very normal things about family building. And when you're marked too, for me to be mixed, but to be marked as a black man, like to be a young black man without a father being raised by a single mother connotates a whole bunch of things as far as being a statistic. I definitely felt that something had been ripped away from me, that it was no longer possible for that to be real, you know?
How do you handle that as a 9-year-old?
How do you handle the death of your dad as a 9-year-old?
My dad died in a car accident. And I didn't really know him very well either. But I was a full-grown adult when that happened. And it was still really hard. Like, it's weird. Even if you don't know your parent, they're still your parent. And for me, it was like this like crushing realization of, well, that's never going to happen now. That's never going to be a relationship because he's gone. And it's a lot to take, but I was a full-grown adult. So I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out, like at 9, maybe you don't understand that or you're not really thinking about that.
Yes, that feeling was internalized. And I can remember feeling a very similar thing to what you could wrap your head around that. I think that thought as an adult, but as a kid, you feel that even though I didn't know my dad very well, but despite not knowing him very well, despite the fact that it was a quote unquote freak accident, despite that there's nobody to really blame, except for myself in a lot of ways. I think even at 9, I was like, well, if I didn't ask him to hang out with me for Father's Day, then he wouldn't be dead.
No.
And, well, I mean, but this is what happens, you know? I think that especially people who go through traumatic events, they usually self-blame. And even for children, however or why ever, maybe it's the ego, but, you know, the blame is placed on self.
Well, thank you for sharing that with me because I know you've shared that with me personally, but thank you for sharing that with me on here because I know that's a really personal story. Okay, so you go to Seattle when you're 8 years old, and then how was high school in Seattle?
High school was I'm so grateful for really growing up in Seattle. High school was crazy. The more I talked to people around the United States, you know, it was so valuable. I mean, my friend group was just, once again, so diverse. I really hope that people raise their children in an environment where they're tested and pushed on and challenged and immersed in the cultural mixing pot that is the United States of America. I feel like I really got it. I was very lucky, you know, to be surrounded by such a diverse group of friends. I remember thinking that for the first time, I've met people that like me. What I ended up finding in Seattle were people who were complete individuals. My friends who were black, they're all unique individuals, and that's why I love my friends back home to death, is because I was surrounded. My peers were people who like thought for themselves. And they said, well, you can't define who I am. And I definitely took my leadership of trusting self-expression, of being like, well, yeah, I am Black enough by trusting my friends around me.
When did you decide to move to Los Angeles and pursue all the things you're pursuing?
I left Temple and came to LA in probably 2011. And it was that idea that like, okay, I'm going to get into UCLA. And I'm going to go to UCLA and I'm going to meet people and I'm going to build a team and I'm going to be a big director and I'll make $1 million by I'm 25.
The dream.
Yeah. It didn't happen. But what really happened, it really happened, sleeping, being out of a car that my aunt loaned me. And so I slept out of this car and I went to Santa Monica College and I was kind of showering in the bathrooms and attending classes, working at BJ's Brewery, PAing, shooting music videos for random people. I worked for Nick Cannon for a while, just hustling. I was just hustling like crazy, grinding $9 in my bank account. And I didn't get into UCLA because I made it to the final rounds of the interviews for the film school. She said, congratulations. That was on Friday. The weekend goes by, Monday comes. I call her. She says, you missed your interview. We emailed you. I used to have an email with numbers in it. She listed the email that was not correct. I said, this must be a mistake. I rushed from that dinky, Pizookie selling racist ass BJ's Brewery to rush to UCLA. They basically told me, F off. For 2 weeks in a row, I showed up every morning. You know, I was crushed. Like everything was about me getting to UCLA. Everything was about me getting to UCLA. But things turned out, right? Like I'm so fortunate. I ended up at LMU, Loyola Marymount University, because of a whole bunch of crazy coincidences and because my mom is always wanting to support her son. And she was in Seattle for a funeral of Kevin Davis, who was a lawyer and who she knew. At his funeral, my mom is talking about her son who was looking to get into UCLA. He's like, oh, well, I work at this school called LMU. They have a scholarship being set up in memory of Kevin Davis. So I applied for that scholarship. Hadn't heard about LMU. Complete opposite of what I thought I wanted, right? Small, private, very white.
And LMU ended up being great. You found such a crew there, didn't you?
I wouldn't be here if not for LMU, you know?
So all this is going on. And again, how are you feeling, Matthew? Like, are you feeling like, fuck?
I feel like when you're, I don't know, tell me if I'm tripping and like check me if this is, but like I feel like when you're like grinding and you're just so hungry and you're just all about getting something, you know, it's like I got to get to that place. Like I just need to keep working until I get to that place. And once I get to that place, like then I'll be good. That I wasn't really checking in on myself, obviously. I don't know how I felt. I think I just felt hungry. I was just hungry. And that hunger is, I think, a quality. I don't think it's necessarily like just a symptom of the moment. I don't know. And when I talked to my friends from that time who like visited, they were like, man, you were in bad shape. But I didn't have the self-awareness to really check in like that, you know?
No, that totally makes sense because you're so focused on getting what you want and making it happen that you exactly what you said, you don't have time to check in. Maybe now you might look back and be like, yeah, I definitely felt this way or that way, but in the moment, you have no idea.
Right. Not successful enough, right? Not.
There it is.
Not worthy enough. But at the same time, I remember looking at UCLA every morning I went there, you know, and I'd be like, I swear I could. And you know, I don't like to talk about myself, but internally I was like, I know I'm better than that kid. Like I know I want it more than that kid. You know, I swear if you just, and that's the permission-based entrance fee like Ava DuVernay talks about. You know, I'm not looking to ask for permission, which is why I tell a lot of students, like, go to community college, work on your voice, create. You don't need somebody's permission to do that.
Maybe not seen enough.
Not seen enough. Wow, yeah. Which then goes back to the idea of not worthy enough. Because, like, why do you need to be seen to have worth? You know?
Yeah. And I think this all ties back into race and just being part of a marginalized community in this country. But I want to get a little bit into growing up mixed race because it's interesting. People see you, they just see a black man, right? But then you do have this biracial makeup.
Yeah, I mean, colorism is real. And growing up, you know, maybe around middle school, there's that whole thing of like, well, choose your team. You know, it's like, choose your team. And also, you don't really get a choice. Like, I didn't have a choice of whether or not I got these situations that we're talking about, where somebody calls you these words. And then when people say the N word, they're just saying nigga, by the way. Like let's be real. Like, so that's why I am saying it, because I just thought I was Matthew Thomas Law Phipps, who's a big dork and loves to play Halo and is this and that. So the qualities of that programming and of that indoctrination is not everywhere. Obviously, my friend group is full of people from all ends of the spectrum. You know, and in Seattle, I grew up around like a very big population of Eritrean, Ethiopian, West African immigrant communities, and so you start to see how much we divide ourselves within the Black community. And of course, this has been placed. You know what I mean? This is not like de facto. This has been like engineered, and it's usually over a quality of like worth and value. So I think in middle school, you know, the fact, because I grew up around kids, and once again, I grew up around people who made their own mind up. I have homies who are dark skinned and who skate and who wear tight jeans and who are doing things that now aren't necessarily racialized as much. You know, they still are, but then especially, you know, until you have Lupe Fiasco and music like that, when you have G Unit and tall tees and do-rags on, and the idea of being Black and that's being shouted at you from every avenue is like, you have to look like this. I think the fact that when you have these values, when you have a diverse music taste, and when you skate or when you snowboard or when you do these things that can be just as Black, like that's what we say, right? Oh, like swimming isn't Black. Says who? Since when? Right. Reading isn't Black. What?
Yeah.
When you are mixed race, that fence line of saying like, well, what are you? I remember a guy said that. What are you then? You know what I mean? And the world is telling me I'm Black. I've only been raised by a Black woman. I don't really have a relationship with my white side, so I've always, you know, considered myself Black. But at the same time, I have to acknowledge the fact that the privilege of colorism and being light-skinned is a real thing. But I have had arguments, you know, where it's like, how are you saying that to me? From your classification of what Black is, you grew up in a private community, and you're coming at me, and I've had to be jailed and assaulted.
Yeah, I mean, it's fucked up, because it's like there's colorism, there's racism, and it comes out from all angles. But when it comes from within your own community, I feel like personally it hurts more. And being like Afro-Latina, which wasn't a word that existed when I was growing up, but just being like a darker skinned Latin woman, it was the same. Like, I had a similar situation where, you know, to the Black girls, I wasn't Black because I was Dominican. And to the Latin girls, I wasn't Latin enough because I didn't really speak Spanish. And then the white people just think I'm whatever, mixed, or, yeah, I'm kind of like, so this feeling of like never feeling like I belong. And genetically, I am pretty much mixed race. I mean, I actually took one of those 23andMe things. My ancestry is about 40-something% from Africa, 40-something% from Europe, mostly Spain and Portugal, and like a little bit of Native American Indian in there. And the only thing that makes me different from, let's say, you is the fact that our conquerors spoke Spanish. So my family speaks Spanish, and we have a quote unquote Latin culture that I grew up with, Latin music, Latin food. But at the end of the day, the molecules, the DNA is exactly the same. So I totally feel you as far as like never, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but not feeling like I could ever be Black enough, or I could ever be white enough, or in my case, I can ever be Latin enough, and instead feeling somewhere in this like middle.
Yeah, and that desire never tended towards the white side, except for the question. It's always a question mark, you know? It's like, well, why don't I fit in anywhere, you know? Because you want to feel that, I think, sense of belonging and that familial sense. And especially when you say Black culture, it's such a kind of amorphous thought process, you know, because we're talking about a culture that has been torn away from what most people would do when they say, well, trace your family back to the Mayflower and then go back to the mythologies of Ireland. When you're left outside of that, or being named by what the world is telling you are and what you feel you are, to be mixed races, sometimes to feel like you don't have a home in the culture that you are, and also an active kind of gardener of, you know what I mean? Like, or representation of, rather. Yeah, man, that term because that's kind of what it seems to be like. Well, what culture do I belong to? And that's to speak about Black culture as if it's a big monolithic thing, which is not. It's so varied. It's so beautifully diverse in so many things, and that's the divided mentality. So that's why I keep coming to this idea of like, well, I feel like cats were only saying that because they've been taught that, right? Well, don't speak like that, like, or why do you speak like that? That's not Black, and that's as if to say that ownership of intelligence is racialized. That's taught to kids, and then we regurgitate it, obviously, and also the fact that we can be many things, and that's the recent, I guess, realization. Obviously, as being an adult, it's like, well, I can be many things and still be Black. Like I can be many things and still be myself, or still be exemplary of my community. Yeah, that goes to the mentality that so many kids are taught, obviously.
Yeah. Did you ever, though, personally feel like not Black enough?
Oh, yeah, definitely. But that's what's crazy is every time I come home, I look at my mom, and I'm being raised by a Black woman, which usually is used as like the cornerstone of I mean, that's what props up, I would argue, our entire country, Black women, right? So when you have this external definition of what Blackness is coming at you from all angles in your mixed race, you're like, well, does that mean I'm not Black because I skate? Or does that mean I'm not Black because this white girl said that to me because she thinks that Ja Rule and 50 Cent are what Blackness is? It's just this idea that you keep hearing from around you. And I think when kids are trying to find their identity in such an angsty time in middle school, that the racial anxiety that exists in oneself, because it's like, wait, no, this is what I am. I was raised by a Black woman. This is what I'm being treated and mistreated, and I'm being persecuted for the color of my skin. But more and more, I think the definition of what Blackness is starts to organically find its root in you, when these things happen, because it's like, oh, well, maybe I'm just, I mean, this is a later on example, but you start to think, oh, okay, well, that's right. Black is broad in a certain sense. I'm not saying broad as in like this brother said the other day, where if you consume Black culture, you're Black. That's not true at all. But
no, that doesn't count.
But I'm saying Black is broad as in Black is eclectic. When they say Black is beautiful, they mean, I think, Black is wonderfully diverse in the forms that it takes, and it moves, but it at all times moves with beauty. And I think that this is, as a sixth grader, I wasn't thinking that. As a sixth grader, I was thinking, well, I better wear a tall tee. For real, it's like, oh, well, shoot, I better get my nappy fro braided up and have zero hang time, but at least I'll have these cornrows, right? Like,
oh, man. Isn't that crazy? It's just like it just takes one kid to say something.
Yeah.
To just make you spiral.
Sure. This is a crazy conversation.
I mean, I think this is perfect, what you just said, and the feelings of not Black enough. Clearly, anyone listening to this is going to know what's going on in this time. It is now June 2020. We have COVID. We are recording remotely because of it. We also now have about 2 weeks of protests. I want you to kind of talk to me about the last 2 weeks for you, because you've been doing so much, and you've been out there, and you've been protesting, and you've been activating on all sorts of things. So I would love to transition to talk about that a little bit. I'm
still trying to wrap my head around it. Obviously, Gracie, I think I just felt the urge to jump and jumped in. As somebody said, the graphite was blown on the fingerprint on like the murder scene. We are standing on top of the shoulders of people who have moved mountains in civil rights. We have to remain eternally grateful for the work that was done, because that is, I think, the positive incrementalism, is the idea that each generation must carry the ball forward. And I felt that I was supposed to be there, and then suddenly it's been 2 weeks, and I haven't really stopped, I guess, being out there. We were out there the other day. Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about that a little bit. So I recently had surgery. My thyroid was taken from me. So I had my surgery, went well, and as soon as I felt better enough, I decided to go to a protest, and Matthew joined me along with my friend Natalie and our friend Elijah. And it was a beautiful protest in Silver Lake, Los Angeles. But I gotta say, Matt, you, within about 5 minutes, I think Natalie and I went to get water and grab a poster, and we turn around, and all of a sudden you have
the whole crowd chanting. And then, a little while later, everyone is in the middle of the intersection and we are taking a knee for George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And you're leading us through that. It was beautiful. Time stopped. Sunset and Lucille, it's a busy corner and there were a lot of cars and everyone stopped. I've been seeing the videos that you and your friends have been creating and documenting, and the photo. It's just been magical to see because it's a fucking crazy time. And to see the passion that a friend has and to see that in action and to see all our friends really just kind of stepping up. Everyone's stepping up. It really does feel like, okay, maybe this one is different. Maybe this time things will actually fucking change.
I've been thinking about that, of just what's the limit that we have set for ourselves? And I think for the theme of not blank enough, why do we wait for permission to speak the truth? And you know it's the truth because you feel it in your heart. And you know it's the truth because you can trust your heart because you know who you are and because you have people who love you, who you can trust, and they trust you. George Yancey was talking about this, a professor, he was saying about how when the standard is whiteness and white supremacy, and when leading philosophical thinkers say that sub-Saharan Africans or black people have no soul, which is to say why when you say I can't breathe, breath is really referring to spirit. Black people don't have a spirit. So that's been the standard, right? We treat black bodies like they're post-mortem already. Anyways, when you follow that thought of like Descartes, it takes a certain level of privilege to say, I think, therefore I am. To wonder at the eternal thought of like, why do we exist? And you're saying, well, I think, therefore I am. So now I have some purpose. But, and Yancey talks about that, where that African proverb, and I wish I knew the tribe, I am because we are. I know I am because I can look to my left and there's Gracie. I look to my right and there's Elijah. And these people who I love are also having a compassionate propulsion, saying that I see an injustice, I see a wrong and I want to make it right. Or I see something that is flawed and I want to make it better. Or I see that there is a need and I want to contribute. And maybe in all those times, as a kid, in middle school, like I waited for the permission to be cool. I waited for the permission to be black, or I waited for the permission to use my voice that was suppressed. We are showing or demonstrating, I think, the story that is such a beautiful story, but that is really clothed in hypocrisy, which is the idea that America is one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Oh, okay, nice story. So here we are. What's more important to me right now than pushing that ball, than lifting my voice with all these other people, especially in our digitized, detached generation, that there's an idea that life is a comment section and everything is about commenting and everything is about consumption and everything is about feeding that need to be complacent and pacified. And then this is like the production, you know what I mean? Like this is the spontaneous combustion that fires, hopefully, engines that continue to move on through their lives and that are progressive in the sense that they are for a better tomorrow, for a better today. Because we have a lot of pressing issues, obviously, as a species and as humanity, so. But to tell you the truth is because, I saw something fucked up and I wanted to do something about it.
In simplest terms. Dude, yeah, I mean, fuck, yes, thank you. When we were talking about, like, not feeling black enough, let's say, I do think the marginalized communities in general, there might be a bigger umbrella to that. And it might be not feeling seen enough or not feeling empowered enough. Because I do feel like as a person of color, as a woman of color, there is always this inner critic or this inner thought of, I can't do that. I don't have the power to do that. I don't have the quote unquote right to do that. I think it's something that people, first generation kids of color, LGBTQ, like this feeling of, in this country, we're constantly being told and we constantly see that white people are quote unquote better. White people are running shit. White people were here first, which is obviously not true. We all know that. But this feeling of you don't belong, we do. You hear that enough, you see that enough, and you start to believe it in a sense. And so then when something like this happens, because it's not like George Floyd was the first person this happened to. We have a long list of people this has happened to. Maybe it was the fact that COVID was going on and people didn't have, a job to go to the next day. This is constantly in their faces. There is this feeling of now, this time, people are fucking rising up and feeling like, no, I do belong here. This is my country. I am an American citizen just as much as you are. And we're dealing with shit on a daily basis. It's funny. I think people can admit to racism when it's overtly racist. But when it's the little shit that people of color have to deal with on the daily, especially Black people, they don't see that. If you are not that, you don't see that. You don't experience that. You don't feel that.
Right. And it feels like the first time that maybe at a very broad level that white people are saying, wait a second, this is my problem. Like, this is a white problem. You're not a bystander. You're actively complicit. A lot of this is because we start to arm ourselves or try to think that these stereotypes protect us, when in reality, right, they're actively harming. How do we start to unlearn these songs that you've been taught about your worth, and then even about dealing with your worth? Therapy is such a stigmatized thing that we have to obviously undo and make that accessible. And talking about mental health, Black males, I have so many homies who need therapy, but the idea of being vulnerable, because we haven't had the privilege of being vulnerable. That's what's crazy. We have a generational privilege of being vulnerable. My grandpa was never able to be vulnerable. You know what I mean? Coming from Jim Crow South, Mobile, Alabama, my nana was never able to be vulnerable because you had to be the image of strength.
That's still on us. I mean, that's why they say, like, the hospital statistics and the birthing statistics and doctors not believing them when they say they're in pain. And you're a strong Black woman, and that's ingrained in us.
I mean, implicit bias is, that's a whole thing, isn't it?
Yeah, we can talk for hours. Well, shit. Okay. So to wrap this up, we're 2 weeks now of protest, and, people are signing petitions, sending emails, donating, doing everything they can do. Can you just give, a piece of advice of what to keep doing?
I keep quoting a South African gentleman who was a revolutionary during apartheid. It's not about giving your life to this, it's about giving the rest of your life. So I think that interpersonally, it is about challenging and calling out those dangerous biases. But also what you could do is learn how to get involved at a local level and being educated on the manners of what it means to defund the police and to reimagine, to have the curiosity and the imagination to turn your curiosity into education and your education into engagement and then engagement into action, right? So there are so many people around you, I guarantee you, who are very active in places of concern. So whether that's city council meetings and being informed on what the issues are, being put to the table and letting your voice be heard, discussing these things with your elected representatives, and then knowing what's going to be on the ballot when you do vote, so that when you're voting as informed as possible. And if you're an artist, just use your voice and use it authentically to yourself. Use it as authentically to what your heart is telling you to express. Live the life that you've imagined. A few of those are concrete calls to action, but I think that if we're going to have that better world, it's about everybody finding that empathy. And remember, these are slim slices out of the whole pie that is white supremacy, and that is a topic that for the first time is really, I guess, hopefully being acknowledged. So, these things, I hope people with their children aren't hiding their children from the reality that the world will continue to broadcast to them.
This was beautiful. I loved getting to know a little bit more about your childhood, especially.
I love talking to you.
And thank you for your insight, and thank you for your call to actions. And I'm going to end with telling our audience where to find you, which is on Instagram. I am Matt Law.
Thank you, Gracie.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for listening to Not Blank Enough. Until next time, please take care of yourself and others, and know that you are more than enough. Check the show notes for links and info about today's guest. Please subscribe to Not Blank Enough wherever you get your podcast, and follow us on Instagram at NotBlankEnoughPod. This episode was produced during the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 and recorded remotely. Our show today was produced by Gracie Mercedes and Dave Hill and edited by Douglas Sarine and Colleen Beasley. Not Blank Enough is a Gumption Pictures production.